This podcast was previously recorded before the spread of COVID-19. We at The Difference fully support the government recommendations around social distancing, limiting non-essential movement, social gatherings, and supporting social isolation measures to give us the best chance to fight this thing.
There's a lot of people who will buy things based on those logic. It is cool because it makes so much amazing environmental sense. But that market is so small because the majority of people buy things based on emotion, and particularly cars, which are as personal in many ways as your clothing.
Hello there and welcome to The Difference podcast. This is the podcast that we'll be talking about everything tech-related, businesses, entrepreneurship, people that are hustling, the game changers and the change makers, people that are out there at the forefront trying to change the world in different ways. This episode we get to talk to Dave Budge from Jaunt Motors. Jaunt works to upcycle iconic four-wheel drives, refurbishing them into electric vehicles for adventure. Entering into the EV market in a new way, they aim to be one of Australia's leaders in sustainable transport. Dave grew up in Bendigo, Victoria, spending as much time as possible exploring remote parts of Australia. So Jaunt was inspired and founded on the feeling of guilt for driving a diesel four-wheel drive to explore pristine natural sites. Dave has 2 decades of experience leading top digital experience agencies combining emerging technology with beautiful design. So what do you think about the idea of Jaunt in a country like Australia? Do you think you could create a company like this in any other country?
Yes, I think the ingredients exist in a lot of other countries, but there is a particular set of circumstances that made it something that we felt was right for Australia. And you know, like any good startup should, you know, it was about recognising a problem, both that is a larger societal level problem and a more intrinsic personal problem as well, and trying to find a solution that could solve both of those things, or you know, go on a journey to solve both of those things. So I think Australia has, you know, the unique ingredients of a very strong car culture, recognition of that, great pristine wilderness seen as adventure destination by people who live here and people around the world. But it's also got problems of adoption of electric vehicles. I mean, saying that's a problem is an interesting thing. It's a very, very slow adoption compared to almost every other developed country. It's got some of the highest transport emissions in the world, and not just because of distance, but per capita, per kilometre. We have terribly inefficient vehicles, no regular emissions testing or roadworthy testing and different things like that. It's also got a problem of, not a problem, but it has low population density and it's a large country, which means that we have comparably very, very poor transport infrastructure. So it means that private vehicles are the only way to get around in most parts of the country, apart from, you know, the major capital cities. So that's not necessarily something that can be solved by a new wave of personalised sort of mobility that's coming along, electric scooters, bikes, those kinds of things, which are great for shorter distances, infrastructure that is around, or other transport methods that are going at a certain speed. Once you get out into regional Australia and the roads are 80 kilometres an hour and have a crumbling edge, an electric scooter is not the type of transport for that. So being able to create something that both draws on the heritage of transport that we have and has some sort of an iconic look and gets people excited about the vehicle, not just because it's an EV, but because it looks cool or whatever, introduce people to EVs, and at the same time help solve in the best way we can some of the transport challenges that exist around Australia, and enable a change that has already begun, but it's very much, you know, in the, I don't know, growing up in the 80s, people would drive from where I grew up in Victoria up to Queensland for a holiday. And no one does that anymore. People fly. So transport changes, and whether that's flying or you know, train travel's really made a comeback. There's all these other alternative methods of getting around, and less car ownership in certain demographics. So felt that the time was right to kind of combine all of these things and do something that hopefully Australia could get excited about.
Yeah, I think they are excited because you've talked a little bit about the Australian landscape, but would you say that has been some of the influence in the creation of Jaunt?
I think it is. I think it has to be because some of our core ingredients are part of that. So if your listeners aren't familiar, we're working with old Land Rovers, and that, whether you know what a Land Rover or a Jeep or a Land Cruiser, it doesn't really matter. Classic old-fashioned four-wheel drives, like basically like a box that look very cute, I think, but tough at the same time. And the reason that I think those hold a certain place and a certain nostalgia in Australia, whether we grew up with them or not, four-wheel drives are a huge part of the culture here. And we have, if you look at the car sales in Australia, new car sales, it is so dominated by four-wheel drives, SUVs, more so than anywhere else in the world. So it's, usually the Ford Ranger, Toyota Hilux, those kind of utes are top of the car sales. But then it's about sort of 10 of the top 15 cars are utes or SUVs. Now, even somewhere like the United States, while there might be a few like pickup trucks high up, it's very quickly sedans and hatchbacks and more normal cars. Yeah, so there's this something I think, both a combination of 100 years of car companies marketing to us and creating this idea of, you've got the idea of road trips and family travel and camping, pushing us into higher value cars. But I think that there's also, our natural desire, like camping outdoor industry has exploded over the last 10, 15 years and has grown from a base of that's what you do. I mean, we've got this amazing, one of the last sort of great wilderness areas of the world that does actually require not necessarily a four-wheel drive in terms of that capability, but you do want a reliable car. You drive a few hours out of Perth, you're going to want something that isn't going to break down. And so having while any other car made by a modern company is super reliable, once you start driving on dirt roads for 2 days in a row, things start to overheat and wear out and whatever it might be. So the landscape of Australia has influenced that car choice, which has been influencing it forever. And the reason that we have all these old Land Rovers to use and to upcycle is because back in the 60s and 70s, it was the only four-wheel drive that you could buy. So Australia was buying about half of the Land Rovers, and these are a car made out of the UK. Australia was buying half of the Land Rovers made because every farmer bought one. What else was there to buy? Every government department bought them, fire service, whatever it might be. So there's thousands and thousands of these vehicles that are there that hold some kind of nostalgia. The Bush Tucker Man drove them, Albie Mangles, all this like old school 70s, 80s explorers of Australia drove these cars. And before that, the people who, carved the first tracks across the desert were doing it in these vehicles. So there's this inbuilt nostalgia built from the landscape, and still a landscape that in many ways really does require in some ways, or you want a car that is a bit more capable. There's certain beach tracks that you want to go down to get to a surf spot or a picnic ground or something that sometimes really do require a four-wheel drive. And then aside from that, we've always sort of thought about Jaunt as trying to create vehicles that belong. And we mean that by, if you take a holiday somewhere and you fly, you can take a flight now from Melbourne to Margaret River. And if you were to rent a car and you could rent a Corolla and cool, fine car, but it doesn't feel like it's right.
I don't think it would feel as nice,
right? So,
being a Corolla.
But if you could hire a car that had spent 30 years on a farm in a vineyard in Margaret River doing its job and then was upcycled into an EV and felt like a car that you would want to use on holidays, but also had connection to that place, not because of its brand and its model number and all that sort of car nerdy stuff, but just because of I'm sort of anthropomorphizing.
I think because of the
cars
history,
too much,
the rich history of that.
Exactly.
That you're tapping into that.
You travel because you want to experience local culture and food and wine and, look, this house I'm staying in an old barn and it was this and it was that. why can't that be the same with transport? So that's very much, I guess, a long way of saying I think that the landscape is integral to the creation and the personality of the vehicles that we're using to upcycle to create our product.
I think you're doing a great job. So how does Jaunt solve the diesel problem really in the four-wheel drive world? Can you explain a little bit about the model?
Yeah, solve the diesel problem. Australia is an interesting place for fuels. We have some of the dirtiest fuels around. A lot of places have higher, and I think I just mentioned it briefly, but we really have very little emission standards, no emissions checks on vehicles like they do in a lot of other countries, and very limited standards on fuel quality. So it's something that I think that a big thing about introducing electric vehicles into Australia has been somewhat of a chicken and egg scenario where there isn't necessarily models of electric cars that are getting Australians excited. And as cool as Teslas are, they're not necessarily, like, people might spend 100, 150 grand on outfitting their four-wheel drive. The alternative for them was never to get a luxury sedan. It's just a different kind of car that doesn't necessarily identify with them. So when your choices were luxury sedans or kind of futuristic hatchbacks with electric blue highlights, those are outside the bounds of what Australians buy. So firstly, you've had electric vehicles that weren't in consideration for people. Now, things like, the Tesla's just launched their Cybertruck. There's other 4x4 EVs coming, but not for a couple of years. So firstly, you had cars that people weren't getting people interested. And then everyone just assumed that there was no charging points, because you don't see EV charge points in the same way as you see petrol stations as, huge neon signs and on freeways. They're everywhere, but they're just in the shopping centre in the premium car park, or they're at that little cafe or at that winery. It's more like petrol stations were in the 70s where, a little restaurant had a little petrol bowser out the front. So people haven't been aware of the amount of charging infrastructure, and places like WA, sort of places where you wouldn't think, like Victoria is actually one of the worst for EV charging infrastructure, but Queensland, WA are some of the best. There's been a lot of work put in for charging infrastructure up and down the coast. So I think that yeah, it's happening. The state governments, and while there hasn't been very much federal government support in terms of rebates for buying cars and that sort of thing, state governments, local governments have been working on this for years and years because they can see the benefits immediately. So, or the cost saving or the ROI comes in a few years. So, to answer the diesel question, I don't think that while we might be making electric four-wheel drives, we are not in any short term going to be replacing diesel four-wheel drives in Australia for a lot of people, because over in Western Australia in particular, there's a lot of I'm in Victoria and we don't necessarily need hundreds of litres of diesel on a car because the distances aren't that great, but over here you do, and so there's nothing like. Petrochemical fuels are incredible in terms of their energy density. Like, nothing beats them. It's amazing that you can get so much energy out of such a small volume of material, and batteries can't compete with that. So it's going to be a while before we transition away for the people who need a car to do that kind of thing. But saying that, when you start to think about what you actually do with a car and how you use it, that's a small percentage of people for a small percentage of the time. So as batteries become more efficient, more dense, as solar power becomes more efficient, as charging infrastructure gets out there more and more, there's no reason, unless you're needing to drive thousands of 1,000 kilometres, 2,000 kilometres in a day, which people do, but that's not necessarily most fun way to travel either. So if you're wanting to drive 500 kilometres a day, that's totally viable in an EV right now. So I think that as people just need to experience it, and once you start realising that the performance is great, it feels great, it's got torque, it's got all those things that you look for in a car, but you're also driving essentially for free. Like, most charge points are free, and when you do have to pay, you're paying like $3 instead of 100.
Hundreds, yeah. That's incredible. I think for most people, just that economic cost is a huge incentive. But for a lot of people that are interested in the EV world, they often start with, like a new project from scratch, like a Tesla. But what inspired you to refurbish instead?
I think that it felt, and I think this is where Australia is quite unique, and there is a few other countries I think that fall into that path. Australia has the opportunity where we have had a strong car culture, and we've had a very dry climate, which means that cars haven't rusted. And the cars we're using, for example, have all aluminium body panels, which means they're not rusted out. So it means we have a great stockpile of parts. And one of the considerations whether, in any case, whether it's electric or not, buying a new car to use less energy and use less resources is always an interesting question, because you've obviously got to take into consideration the total cost of that vehicle and cost in terms of environmental and materials cost to make the car. So a new car inherently uses more materials than recycling a car and upcycling a car. So there's a couple of things in that, and that we saw this giant stockpile of vehicles that could be recycled, upcycled, which is great, and that could be done feasibly. It's not necessarily, you can't upcycle something as cheaply as you can manufacture something new these days, unfortunately. There is more high value labour involved, but it meant that, again, like we talked about before, you can bring more personality to it. You can reduce the amount of, you've already sort of sequestered that carbon in the parts and created those things and mined that metal. And so the more recycled components that we can use gives it more personality, gives the car more meaning, but also saves a huge amount of resources. And I think that there is a growing movement in things that are, it essentially becomes a handmade car, and it becomes a car that doesn't feel as, we were just talking just before we started about not buying like crappy toys that are just kind of throwaway items, and cars can become more and more of that. When cars become more and more of a appliance, and a mentor that we have who's spent years, General Motors amongst others, he asks the question of people like, tell me the make and model of the last 3 Ubers that you took. And no one can answer, right? Because it was like generic sedan, generic SUV. They all kind of look the same. And so, but that's sort of part and parcel of the whole thing, when all kind of cars kind of look and feel the same, and that's okay. But when you get in your Uber, all these cars feel the same. Well, why not just have a generic appliance of your own? But the promise, I think, of car share and having and removing ownership from things and having products fit for purpose is that you can really do that you can drive that amazing, cool retro electric 4-wheel drive on the times that's appropriate, and use a different kind of vehicle when that's appropriate.
Well, I think the circular economy is something that you touched upon, but it's really important, I think, for a lot of people to kind of realise that objects have multiple uses, and that we are now, getting into a state where I think people are becoming more socially conscious about waste. I even had a printer I got from Officeworks recently, and then can I even say Officeworks? But I will. I got it from Office, I got it from Officeworks, and after a few months it broke down, changed every cartridge, it still wouldn't work. I went there to actually get it fixed, and the cost of fixing it was more expensive than purchasing a new one. And now it's sitting there like a very expensive paperweight because I refuse to get a new printer. But really, this is the thing that most people throw away, appliances like this, without thinking, the number of things that we're putting into landfill. So I think it's a really purposeful use of machinery that's taken a lot of, labour and technology to put into that initial piece, and then like drawing upon that history and people's preferences. I think it's a great idea. But before you were involved in upcycled EVs, tell us a little bit about what industry you used to work in and what drew you to that.
So I guess I've switched maybe and I realise this in hindsight, almost every 5 years I've seemingly switched between, I guess, sort of digital design, technology and filmmaking. Firstly, filmmaking, because it was the late 90s and the internet wasn't really around. But that kind of grew into multimedia CD-ROMs and things like that.
Still, some people might not know what that is.
No, people shouldn't know what that is, because that was the internet before the internet, when you had to get the internet on a CD. So working with emerging technology, and obviously for the last 20 years that's heavily involved the internet, and really, I guess, as a designer in a sense. So designing, I guess, user experience, and that's evolved from, how do you structure a menu for a very small website, through to, I guess early 2000s was about everyone needed a website, but no one really knew why. And so, Big M needs a massive new website, but why and what for? You guys don't even have Big M over here. Let's say a Choc Chill website, right? You probably do. So there was kind of, I guess, a lot of effort for not a lot of purpose and utility. And I think that where I've been most happy is creating stuff that has storytelling and utility combined. So I left that sort of career and went into filmmaking, and I'd kind of been doing a lot more video content and different things for the web, and that sort of transitioned into documentary making. And so documentary, TV, film, and a lot of that was very much the early days of digital cinema, I guess we would probably call it now, but really that transition from video looking like video and film looking like film, and then technology getting to a point where you could create cinematic work without needing millions of dollars and thousands of dollars of literal film. And so that opened up a world of filmmaking that allowed us to, work with an amazing filmmaker in Rwanda to create the first feature film there, to shoot with a very small crew a documentary series for SBS around the world on art and cooking, on a lot of other projects that were really fun. We shot some of the I think the first film on digital SLRs, so digital cameras that could suddenly shoot video for the first time, and we worked with an amazing sort of cast and crew, a combination of US and Australian talent, to make those cameras work in a feature film environment. So in hindsight, I realised so much of what I've done to that point was very much trying to, how do we bring in emerging technology and make that useful? And then I moved back into, I guess, interaction and digital design, but into an agency that was an agency that I'd worked for previously, but had grown sort of fivefold and was huge and national, and had a different level of responsibility. And and I mean that in the sense that going from, designing kind of promotional websites into digital tools and technologies are the foundation of, or are purely the business, like what you guys are doing, or it's something that is so integral to the operation of the larger business that you couldn't imagine it without it. And so, for example, we built all the digital systems for Jetstar, which of course is operating aeroplanes, and that's a very, very difficult thing in itself. But the customer experience point of it is that you actually spend almost as much time, except when you're flying to Perth and you're on the plane for 4 hours, you're spending more time on their website, checking in, doing all those things than you are doing physical stuff on the plane. So technology and digital experience as integral to the product that is being sold, and that kind of, when that's that amount of money is being spent, that amount of responsibility is there, you're moving more and more into, I guess, strategic design, service design. Inherently it's product design. So being more and more aware of creating products and services that were mission critical kind of stuff, and higher end, and working with amazing people and really high end stuff. And I think that experience gave me the confidence to go, this stuff, bringing emerging tech together and working, I guess, in, I had titles like head of innovation and things like that, but whatever that means. But, innovation in one definition is just commercialization of invention. And so I'm not a mechanical engineer or electrical engineer or whatever, but what I can do is, and I said this to like our head of HR one time, it's like, I don't know what I should do. Like, all I'm good at is learning stuff from the internet and getting people excited about that. And
that's a very good skill, because I mean, when I'm thinking about the way that your life's gone, you've talked a lot about design and creativity and digital experience, but all of these have obviously kind of, come together with a project like Jaunt. What would you say about some of your earlier experiences? Like, where did you grow up, and do you think that had an influence on what you're doing now?
I'm sure it did. How could? Yeah, and I use it, I guess, as a story and a reference point. So I grew up in a town called Bendigo in regional Victoria. So it's about probably 150,000 people now, but less than that when I was growing up. And it's an old gold mining town. I was always very conscious. Bendigo has no natural features other than the fact that it used to have gold in the ground. So it's surrounded by national park, but dry sort of eucalyptus sort of scrubland. And I say that because I was always conscious of that it didn't feel like a place that humans would have settled in if not for these other reasons. But like a lot of places like that, it then has fostered, and particularly generationally, I think in the late 70s, you had a lot of people moving to central Victoria for art and music. And my generation, the kids of those people that moved there, were able to grow up together in a community that was very, perhaps worldly, maybe for what was just a small town in country Victoria. Bendigo has a huge, arts and music scene. There is a university there, and all those things helped make it something that made us very. I mean, early 90s, mid 90s was sort of height of grunge and alternative, and it was like sort of the second wave. It was the kids of the hippies in a way, and so we were influenced by that from very, very early on, and that environment, I guess, so many other small towns around Australia is just like, it's about football or it's about some other thing and that's it, whereas it was not. I mean, it was still kind of weird, but it was still like, it was fine to be just into music, and it wasn't revolving all around sport. It wasn't around all these things. So it allowed a bunch of us, and I can only really speak for my generation, right? But it allowed us to have horizons expanded beyond the usual, which I think was really good and really influential.
So it sparked a kind of curiosity in you for things or new ideas, it sounds like. And when you think about Jaunt, or if I think about, for instance, if I ever have car troubles, I'll probably blankly stare under the hood of my car and not really know what to do. So what sort of experience did you have with four-wheel drives or cars prior to starting Jaunt?
Yeah. So
did you learn it on YouTube?
Yep. So I only got my license when I was 27.
And why is that?
Just didn't need it. Just kind of to be anti-cars a bit, maybe. But then I lived in Melbourne and trams and bikes and all these kinds of things. And I bought a car that was at the time the cheapest, sort of most economical diesel car I could buy, because it was before this was sort of like early 2000s when there wasn't, like you can buy a diesel car in all kind of forms now. But back then it was like there was Mercedes from the early 80s and there was full drives. So I bought a full drive because it was the most economical diesel, because I was making biodiesel with a community group in Melbourne. And so and at that time you could also buy biodiesel in a few select petrol stations because South Australian Farmers Fuel were doing it. It was kind of like, we were all hoping that biodiesel would be a thing. So the only reason I got into four-wheel driving was because I happened to have one because I was running biodiesel. And so using that, I was like, oh, this is kind of fun, and we can get to better places to go hiking and camping and that kind of thing. And that led me to just, I've got a got a fun, giant, complex object that I want to tinker with, and it's interesting. And so I learnt, from YouTube or pre-YouTube, from forums and different things, what I needed to know about cars, which wasn't very much and still isn't probably very much in terms of knowing I don't know how petrol engines work, right? I've never had a petrol car and I don't need to. So I've learned enough to make diesel engines work, but the rest of the car, and with four-wheel driving, you understand suspension and you know all these things. But the most that I've learned is from, pulling apart all these old Land Rovers. And I think that those are there's been obviously a massive advancement of technology in the automotive industry from 1960 to 2020. So an old Land Rover is if you have sort of natural, I guess, mechanical aptitude, and I always like making and fixing things and whatever, that you can look at it and go, oh yeah, someone just built that, and you can see how it went together. Whereas now you look at an engine and it's just quite a different thing, and it was literally built by robots, so it's harder to understand.
Oh, crazy. But a lot of people have been looking for an alternative to the fuel we use, especially as more and more countries and individuals are aware of climate change. And in 2006, we all saw a glimpse into the future as Smart USA kind of released their first two-seater, which topped out at 100 k's an hour with an 8-hour recharge time. But a lot of people struggled to take EVs seriously back then. And what do you think's changed now?
Tesla changed things.
Yeah.
I think the challenge has been, and look, you cannot underestimate the fact that Tesla came out and did I think everything right in terms of they don't talk about. You go to the Tesla website and it does not talk about environmental credentials. It talks about luxury and performance. That's the car they make, and now as they have more models, it's a bit different. But particularly when it was just Model S, and then Model X, it was just luxury and performance. They positioned themselves there as like has better performance and equal luxury to anything else you can buy for a similar price. So it didn't try and say that you didn't have to buy it purely for a environmental reason. Yeah, right. They made a cool brand, and I think that. One of the things that we think about is that every single EV attempt in Australia has failed. So what makes us different at all? One of those things is timing. I think that the timing is right. I think the other thing is that we are trying to create a vehicle that is very much based on emotion and not necessarily on logic. And that sort of sounds counterintuitive a little bit, but almost all of the EV-related startups up till now have been a logical engineering smart choice. So when you have, there was a company called, I'm forgetting the name now, but they kind of made a car called, I think it was called the Electron Bolt, something like that. It was basically a Hyundai Getz converted to electric. Now, that's very practical and logical, like small city car, very similar to like the smart car you're talking about, similar size. And it makes sense in that way because the use case for it is correct, but a Hyundai Getz is the car that you buy when you don't care about cars. Like you just want basic transport. So you don't want to pay 3 times more for a Hyundai Getz that looks exactly the same, but is more complex to operate because it's full of your battery level is rare. It talks about amp hours and kilowatt hours and all this electrical engineering stuff is in your face. It's harder to use and it's not cool and it's cost you 3 times more. And why? Why get it? So it was just a really hard decision. And there was a lot of companies trying to do things like that, small delivery vans. There was even a spin-off of Holden was converting a Commodore into electric, but it was a generic base model white Commodore. And so who cares? It's just now a more expensive base model white Commodore. And so it's hard to. There's definitely a market. There's a lot of people who don't care about. Will buy things based on those logic. It is cool because it makes so much amazing environmental sense. But that market is so small because the majority of people buy things based on emotion, and particularly cars, which are as personal in many ways as your clothing. Now, even when people say, and now a lot of people don't care about cars, and awesome, but that means they also don't want to spend a lot of money on them. So that's been the big challenge is creating an electric vehicle that has any emotional kind of resonance with Australia. And again, the fact that the infrastructure is now there and there's this wave of infrastructure and a much bigger wave of people being aware of their carbon emissions.
So you talked about like companies like Hyundai or even Porsche who have started creating their own lines of electric vehicles and trying to switch from petrol and keep performance on track. How does Land Rover fit into the picture?
Yeah, so those companies now, I mean, everything in the past was, small little companies in Australia trying to convert new cars or converting new petrol cars, pulling out the motor, putting in stuff. But all the major manufacturers around the world, almost all of them, have a full battery electric vehicle available. Now, we don't really get them all here because Australia has a very, very tiny market for, very, very tiny amount of EVs available at the moment. But they all create some pretty amazing products. Land Rover themselves have had a plug-in hybrid available for quite a few years in Range Rovers that will do 50 or 60 kilometres purely on batteries. They don't have any pure electric things yet, but Jaguar Land Rover, the group, has the I-Pace, which is their full electric SUV, and electric. There will be full electric vehicles coming in every one of their models over the next few years. So every major manufacturer is doing it, and pretty much, at least in Europe anyway, everyone's just stopped developing diesel tech in particular and putting all that into EVs because it's coming.
And how do you compete with these kind of Goliaths of the industry, and also the petrol and the diesel industry in general? What are the sort of challenges that you faced as you've been trying to go along pitching your idea?
I think that we fall outside new vehicles enough. Our cars are very different, and in good and bad ways. We are not it's never going to be as safe. It's never going to have airbags. It's never going to have all these kinds of things. But we're building a very different kind of product. So yeah, it's transport, and yeah, it's got four wheels and it's a car. And I mean, maybe I'm getting too sort of deep into, the specialized startup specialization.
Isn't
it's
it?
An experience, right?
Yeah.
And so we would sometimes almost flippantly say that we're kind of creating horse rides, right? So it's like transport of last century as just a fun little experience, as a day trip kind of thing. And so, but part of that and how that influences the product that we actually create is that we're building a single-use car, and I mean that in the sense that new vehicles, if you think about any car ads that you see on TV, they talk about how many screens they have, the size of the screen, that they've got Apple CarPlay. They talk about all these technology features, which are cool and you want, but it's all tech and complexity that's built to build in value to ownership that you learn to use over 6 months and fills out a brochure really well. Look at all the specs and look at all the options, and you're cross-shopping with this other model and whatever. So all those things are built to have perceived value. These are cheap digital things, are cheap to put in the car compared to all the steel and aluminium components, but they add value and they add features easily. What we're trying to do is the opposite to that, because often you get in a new car now and you're like, and the higher end the car is, the more features it has, and the fancier its own custom operating system is, and what does it call this feature? And you get into a car and it's like, do you want sport mode, standard mode, eco mode, and the whole dial changes. It's all cool and fancy.
I do often put it into sport mode, but I don't really know what happens.
And the graphics change and some color changes, and that's all kind of cool, but it's different when we're trying to create, I guess, what we think of as a single-use car. So you come along, you're on holiday, whatever it might be, you want to get in the car, and you're getting in the car not for the car, but for what you're doing with the car, which isn't just commuting. It's driving to a beautiful beachside location. So look out the window. We don't need to add more screens. In fact, we need to add less. So how simple to operate can we make this? And that really falls into our position of how desirable can we make these cars, but how approachable can we make them at the same time, and accessible, So they can be, when the challenge sometimes with electric vehicles has been that people don't feel like they're approachable, that they'll get into something that's high tech, that they'll be like using an Android phone when they're used to an Apple phone. And any of those excuses have stopped Australians driving electric cars. So can we make a four-wheel drive really simple? Can we make an electric vehicle really, really simple where you don't have to do anything, and suddenly you're doing it? And you go and charge, not because you need to, but because it's fun, and suddenly you realise that the charge points are everywhere. And
and that whole road trip didn't give that impact that you've created has been positive rather than I think it's a great startup that you're involved with. And I mean, what is it like to start anything? A lot of founders talk about the difficulty with the startup journey. You first started in 2019 with an Indiegogo campaign to raise capital. What were some of the hurdles that you had in terms of trying to obtain funding?
So many hurdles. But I guess as part of the journey, I think it's, it's easy, not easy. I guess the things when you're creating a startup, depending on what it is and what your skills are, is do you dive in and start building a product? Or do you start talking about the product? And we were conscious of that many EV startups in Australia and many vehicle startups in Australia had come from people who were automotive engineers or whatever and built a product first, because that's some ways that's the easy way to do it, is to just kind of, let's get our money together and go and try and build a prototype and spend 6 months locked away and then come out of the garage and go, hey, does anyone care about this? But that's not the smart way to do it. If you can do it, if you can, I guess, fail fast. And I had that idea of, you're not setting out to fail, of course, but you want to understand, is there a product market fit? Does anyone care? Does anyone care beyond, both Martine and I, my co-founder, are good at talking and getting people excited in person. And obviously, when you're talking to people in person about your startup, almost even if you're not good at talking about it, people are nice and say, that's a great idea, and keep going. It's a very different question when
they have to put money into it.
They have to put money down. They don't know who you are, all those kinds of things. So for us, it was like, how can we refine this on paper and try to create, a business model around this and and go down all these avenues and see which way we should go. Does this work? Does this achieve our objectives best? What do we value as a company? What kind of company do we want to be? What kind of things do we want to be? Who do we want to work with? Can we get people excited? And so launching an Indiegogo campaign was a choice that we made because we knew at some point we had to go out to the world, and it's a difficult thing. I mean, I've worked on crowdfunding campaigns and advised on them, and we weren't at the right point, in that it's way better if you can be out in the market for a year and everyone knows you and you've got this excited fan base and you've got a working prototype and all that. That's the point to go into a crowdfunding campaign. But we knew that what we wanted to do and test was, does the market care? Does the media care? Does wider Australia, is anyone going to pay any attention? And what's the sentiment going to be on that? So that if we just said, hey, we're going to start building an electric car, no one runs a story on that. But suddenly you put a crowdfunding campaign and there's sort of risk and a story to tell, suddenly you can get the media to write a story about it.
And it's a great way of validating.
It validates things, right? MVP. And you can go out there with price points and you can see what people choose, and you can fail with very limited repercussions. I mean, to your ego, sure, but it's a way to sort of test. So we weren't, and I think the danger is that you go in pinning all your hopes on a crowdfunding campaign, and really you're using that as pre-sales, but you need another way to go about it. So for us, we said we were going in there saying, hey, we want $50,000 because that's roughly the cost of the parts that we need to put into this car. And we didn't get that. But what we did get was about 20 grand and amazing media coverage and sentiment and enthusiasm. And understandably, like, we were going out there selling rentals of a vehicle that didn't exist. So, and knowing that people don't base their holiday around a rental car booking, particularly one that doesn't exist and one that doesn't exist in any particular location. So, I mean, maybe we're just naturally optimistic, but the feedback that we had from that and the support that we had from that was a great beginning, and it essentially meant we sold 100 days of rental bookings with the car, which if you think about it is, a third of the year, right? That's really the rental availability we had for its first year. So,
and it's like also about trying to mobilize your supporters, isn't it?
Yeah,
and
yeah.
Really, you're not pitching to the whole world. You're only pitching to the people that are going to get behind it.
Yeah.
And it's great to.
So it gave us that push together to get that collateral together to, put a cheap, cheerful logo there, like whatever, just get it out there to the world. And that suddenly gives realness. We've made $1. Like, we've actually had people spend money on our product, and that is a really great stepping stone into having further conversations around investment. That we don't just have an idea that people are excited about a PowerPoint. We have people who have put down money to use this product, and that cascading awareness that just flowed on from that was huge. And so that led into people purchasing commissioning private vehicles from us, which we knew was always going to be a thing. And all that flowed from that initial big push. So it was hugely valuable in that respect.
So what's the biggest roadblock that you faced so far, and how have you overcome it?
It's just really expensive to build a car, right? And to build multiple cars. So we've built lots of big multi-million-dollar expensive things, but not some physical products, but not big physical products, and to sort of set them up for scale. So building a product that you're not building just a one-off of, that you're building to be repeatable is a new challenge for all of us involved in this, and with some great advice and insight from other people. But it's just been time, a challenge of underestimating time, underestimating dollars. That's not underestimating, but just like challenges of space. Cars are big and heavy and all these kinds of things, and you can easily spend a day moving components around. And so figuring out we knew that it was part of the real job with this was, we're not inventing new kind of batteries and new kind of motors. We're putting them together in a certain way that suits a certain type of vehicle and trying to reach a certain price point. But so that then the challenge is figuring out process and figuring out efficiencies. And that's just hard, right? We don't have almost all of us involved in this project have come from having big teams in big companies. And of course, you're acutely aware that you don't have all those people anymore to work on things. It can be, in practice, it can be tricky to realize that, you are the team. There's only a few of us. And that just means we just can't pull more resources in, and when time is the hard thing. So
it really puts the lean in lean.
Yeah. And then the other thing is that if we were just doing software, we know that world, we know that well, we know the tips, we know the techniques, and they're all readily available to learn from on the internet. The challenge with a lot of what we're doing is we're doing work that's been traditionally done by either professional mechanics or hobbyists. And one of those groups, the professional group, doesn't really put their stuff on the internet. So your resources to learn from are people whose time costs them nothing. In a sense, they're doing it because it's a way to fill time. It's a fun hobby. So figuring out efficient and environmentally friendly as much as we can, and still terribly embarrassed about what we waste and what we use, but doing those things efficiently and well and in a friendly-ish way has been the big learning curve. And only now, after a year, do we feel like we're getting any kind of efficiency around certain processes.
So early into your launch, what do you think are some of your biggest achievements for you so far, and for you personally, What about the advancements that you've seen in the motoring industry?
I mean, for me personally, I think that it's tricky. It's. I wrote it in one of our newsletters that we send out that I've almost always been throughout my career working on multiple projects and really one-off projects. Making videos is, I guess, you're shooting the video, editing the video. Like the process is roughly the same, but the projects are very, very different. I've never worked for 5 years on a TV show, for example. So this is the first time that I've worked on a project that I'm like, well, I'm just going to be doing the same thing for 10 years, but just a little bit faster every time and better every time. But feeling creative within that and knowing always that creativity, there's as much creativity in the construction and the running of a business as there is in the tasks within that business, if you know what I mean. So for us, Martina and I have always worked in head hours businesses, in consultancy kind of business where the professional time is what is being paid for. And yeah, you have a computer, but there's not much else. Building a physical product is a completely different financial model, completely different business model and process model. And so it's been a huge learning curve in a really fun, mind-expanding way on how to deal with all of that stuff. And so it's not so much been, I guess, for me, the funnest and easiest bit to learn before we went into this was all around the EV stuff. So I don't want to say I knew all of that. I definitely didn't, but it was like that was what I was aware of. But what's been, I guess, the biggest learning curve is the business side all around that. And so then the conversations and the introductions and all of that has been really great to understand all of that side of things better. And then I also think that in our YouTube series, people seem to think that I know what I'm talking about. That's that's an achievement, and I mean that in that we've always knew that our role in electric vehicles in Australia was going to be being able to tell a story around them well, because we're not experts in the tech. And so we have to break that down in our own minds and talk about it then in a human understandable way and make it accessible, And so that education-ish, entertainment-y kind of piece has also been really nice to see the feedback around that.
That's great. So let's go back a bit. It's 2010 and you and two partners start a music and film project called Sideshow Alley. What were some of the major takeaways that you could share from creating something from scratch, essentially?
I didn't think we'd talk about Sideshow Alley. So that
Need
was...
a music segue here.
Yeah. So that was a really interesting time where, I talked about it just before about this sort of rise of digital filmmaking and suddenly technology that was really high quality and affordable. And that little moment in time, all around the world really, but particularly in Melbourne, we knew a lot of filmmakers and who had the tech and had the desire. So we kind of envisaged, we'd seen a few projects around the world, a couple in particular overseas that were doing single take music videos and it was sort of the early days of YouTube, and they were doing them well, but they were doing them well from an audio perspective, but a bit crap from a video perspective, because they were musicians filming other musicians. And we were always intrigued by how do you capture that magic that is someone who's awesome playing a guitar, just, you're sitting on a couch next to them and they're playing a guitar and it's magic. What is lost when they go on a stage and they're performing and you hear, then through a PA and whatever, it's just not quite the same. How can we both capture that and also create something for the filmmaking community? It always sounds a bit lame, but it's kind of like, how can we make a jam session? And that's because filmmaking there's so much preparation and planning that you can't that if you just turn up with a camera, what you create is a bit crap. But could we create something that was spontaneous and allowed us to get 8 filmmakers together and just go, you get the wide shot and you get this close up and you get this close up and go, and that was it, and just have fun for a moment. So we created this project where we would get musicians, performing artists of all different kinds, and have them in sort of outdoor locations around Melbourne and also in New York, where they would do one song, one take, no rehearsals. So we captured the mistakes and the personality. I'm always drawn to sort of capturing the mistakes and the personality. It's very much what we're doing in the vehicles. But capturing that moment in time. And so we'd have up to 8 cameras, and we used we were trying to really approach everything in a fresh way, in going, well, how do we want the best sound we can possibly get. But we also, when we're making it for YouTube, we don't want microphones in everyone's face and have people being restricted to being in one spot. You know, you look at live music performances about people having sort of metal in front of their face. So we used documentary and theatre microphone techniques. So we hid microphones in hair and in guitars and would wire people up. So there might be as many microphones or more than there was cameras. So it sounded like a studio recording, but it was live. And we would then put reverb in and post-produce it in a way that you would if you were recording an album rather than just a live performance. And in the same way we would treat the video. We'd colour grade it. We'd do all these things that you would do if it was a very meticulously planned shoot, but instead it was a spontaneous documentary moment. So it allowed us to be, in some senses, quite the shoot was quite quick, the post-production was quite lengthy, but it allowed us to have a volunteer crew of maybe 30 people more that were revolving around shooting these things quite regularly. And so that went from shooting little indie bands in Melbourne, and then through to shooting Australian Ballet, Mumford & Son, like big artists. And I think that was never, it was a really interesting one because we started that with the intention of going, hey, let's do this, and then someone will buy it. Like, I don't know, it was the early days of like influence culture.
It's so good. Someone will buy it.
And so people did make offers, but we very quickly fell in love with it. And it wasn't, nowadays it would be different because brands would come along and want to be involved and they'd sponsor it in some way and they'd realise the value of leaving us alone to create what we created. But back then it was very much people trying to put a price and calculate the cost of the effort we were putting in. And when you did that, it didn't make any sense because we were spending, if you're making music videos in Australia, no matter who you're making them for, like if you get a call from Sony or whatever and it's like, hey, you want to come and be the director on the new Delta Goodrem film shoot, you're probably getting like 10 or 20 grand. Like it's nothing. There's no money in it. We were spending that amount of effort, if we'd paid people properly, doing these things that were spontaneous things full of mistakes. So it didn't really make sense, and we were kind of like, oh, we love it, we don't want to lose control. But then that kind of spurred us on to create, our own thing and very much learn a lot around how do you inspire people to do something for nothing.
Which then you've taken with you now.
Yeah, a little bit. We pay people, but it was also a realisation that if we ever started to pay people a menial amount, that changes the psychology of it. Choosing to do something for free and volunteer is very different to choosing to do something for $100. That you can start to resent that because you've chosen to do it for the money and not the experience. And so there was some interesting lessons, and we burnt ourselves out on that. The effort was sort of too much, and we just it became too big, and the demands from the artists were too big, and we became seen as a media. We were part of the media schedule that bands would do when they came to Melbourne in particular, and it was just felt like a job. And so it sort of paused for a while, and we're still, particularly Ty, one of the co-founders of that, who's over in New York now, and he's still recording some occasionally. But
oh, that's great.
Yeah.
So we're going to wrap it up, but we're just going to go through some quick questions, really rapid fire. Okay. So in your wildest dreams, where do you see Jaunt in 10 years?
In 10 years, I would like to think that we're household name sounds too strong, but people are aware of us, I've always said that a great, amazing thing would be that if we were seen as like cool car rental. I don't think that exists right now. I don't think you associate any car rental brand with being cool. Can we be that? And can we be seen as people creating, beautiful recycled vehicles?
And how about our listeners? How can anybody out there help Jaunt and also make a difference in their own lives?
Those are two very different questions. We're just interested in support is just great for us, and support in meaning just follow us on Instagram, sign up to our newsletter. We're Jaunt Motors on all of the socials, Instagram followers are great, but sign up. We send out a newsletter roughly monthly, and that kind of goes into all the insights around what we're trying to do. A big part of that over the next year is going to be getting vehicles out there, test driving in certain locations, so doing trials out of existing tourism venues. So we would love to come to your town.
Make Jaunt motorists.
Yeah. We'd love to come to your town and hang out for 2 weeks and get people driving an electric vehicle around. That'd be cool.
Oh, that's great. Well, thank you so much, Dave Budge from Jaunt, for being on the Difference podcast.
Thanks, Sarah.
As Dave and the team story continues, Jaunt continues on their mission of repurposing vehicles to help create a sustainable future. As we speak, Jaunt have almost completed one of their projects, Juniper, a 1974 short wheelbase Land Rover. If you want to get involved with Jaunt for your business, or you just want to stay updated on all the amazing things they're doing, you can follow them online at Jaunt Motors or head to their website, jauntmotors.com. Let's take this time to remember that tomorrow is a new day, and after all of this is over, we'll be ready to get back out on the road. Jaunt is building electric vehicles for the future of off-road travel in the Australian outback, while keeping the future of the planet in mind. We have time in the now to reimagine the way we are going to live when all this isolation is over. The thing I love about Dave is his exuberance and his energy, and the way that he's taken his own personal passion for off-road riding and camping and figured out a new way of helping change the world and perhaps reducing our carbon emissions, and just thinking of the small ways that we can all contribute with our own personal passions, I think is remarkable. Follow us on Instagram at thedifference.org and on our website, the-difference.org. And once again, thank you so much for listening. We'll see you soon. This podcast was previously recorded before the spread of COVID-19. We at The Difference fully support the government recommendations around social distancing, limiting non-essential movement, social gatherings, and supporting social isolation measures to give us the best chance to fight this thing. As we face the pandemic of COVID-19 individually and as a community, we acknowledge the difficulty in the current age for our traditional. The government, mental health care providers and charities such as Lifeline and Beyond Blue are supporting the mental health and wellbeing of Australians as we face the challenges of coronavirus pandemic. If you need someone to talk to, please reach out to them and know that you are not alone.